The first slap did not come from a hand, it came from a sentence. "You do not belong in this cabin." The words were sharp as a blade, slicing a cold line across the first-class section and tightening the air as if it were about to shatter. Heather Collins, the lead flight attendant of Aurora Air Flight 718, stood rigid like a column of ice under the warm yellow lights. Her eyes colder than the metal of the radio she gripped tightly. Her voice, rising not just for Damien Cole to hear, but for the entire cabin to witness. Damien looked up, not startled, not panicked, only allowing a single compressed breath to rise, slowly, deeply, powerfully in his chest, as if he were holding on to his own calm, so it would not crack under the surge of anger threatening to break the invisible discipline he had trained into himself for years. The light glinted off his blue tie, illuminating for a brief second, just a brief one, the silent sting of humiliation on his face. But it vanished the moment a few soft snickers rose from the row behind him, like tiny needles pressing into the back of his neck. Eyes began to pin toward the man in the light grey suit, wearing unbranded shoes, and no luxury watch, looking no different from any ordinary businessman. Yet that very ordinary appearance became the excuse for their stares to sharpen into blades. Damien felt the heartbeat of the cabin fall out of sync for a moment. He knew this look. It first appeared when he was 22, standing outside a business lounge with a trembling first-class ticket in his hand. And now, 21 years later, it stood in front of him again, in a new form, but with the same old soul. Heather stepped forward, her heels striking the floor like hammers hitting stone. "You will move to the economy cabin. If you refuse to cooperate, we will require you to leave this aircraft immediately." Her voice was metal, stretched past its limit, ready to snap at any second. A man in a navy blazer across the aisle leaned toward his wife and whispered loud enough for Damien to hear. "He does not look like someone who sits in seat 2. To his left, a red recording light blinked on a passenger's phone. Then another. Then another. The cabin froze like a palace sealed in ice, but underneath that stillness, tiny whispers moved like breaths slipping through cold air, spreading across the rows like oil on water. Damien saw all of it. Every face, every stare, every phone trembling slightly in someone's hand. Each expression told its own story: curiosity, judgment, anticipation. Yet none of them imagined that the man they were watching being humiliated was listening to the rhythm of every breath, every heartbeat, and every unspoken thought in that room. He did not answer Heather. Not a word. Not even a sigh. Only his deep, steady eyes fixed on the space in front of him, as if reminding himself that silence could also be a weapon. But Heather could not tolerate that silence. She lifted her radio, pressing the button so hard that the small click burst through the cabin like an empty gunshot. "Cabin, I need security at seat 2A. We have a fraudulent passenger. Immediate assistance required." Fraudulent. The word dropped heavy like a stone, smashing into a calm lake, sending ripples of suspicion through the cabin. Some passengers snickered, others frowned, some filmed, others looked away to avoid being involved. Damien lowered his head slightly, almost as if he were listening to his own heartbeat, to make sure it did not veer off course. He could not break here. Not in front of them. Not before the truth revealed itself. A woman in row 3, the first one to start recording, whispered, "Why are they not checking his name first?" But her voice dissolved instantly into the storm of emotions swelling in the room. Fear, curiosity, anger, satisfaction, all mixing into a rising tempest. Damien felt the weight of those stares, the coldness in Heather's voice, the tension in the cabin stretched tight like a string pulled to its final limit. And then one more breath. He closed his eyes. They had no idea what they were doing. They had no idea who they had just provoked. And when he opened his eyes, the look he carried was no longer the look of a man humiliated. It was the look of a man waiting for the moment when the truth would tear the floor out from under this room, but they did not know that yet. None of them knew. All they saw was a black man sitting silently in the wrong seat. But in that silence, with dozens of phones recording every moment, Damien understood one thing here, in this exact moment. He was not the one on trial. It was the system itself, standing under the light. And the moment of reckoning was coming faster than anyone in that cabin could imagine. The silence in the cabin was no longer an empty stillness, but a thin, tightened wire, vibrating with every breath, warning that something was about to snap. Damien Cole sat there, shoulders straight, his hand resting lightly on the armrest, as if seat 2A were the most natural place in the world for him to be, while 3 Aurora Air uniforms turned the first-class cabin into a stage for public humiliation. Heather Collins pressed the radio against her lips, her eyes sharp like a blade, ready to carve another line into the air that was already straining under the pressure. "This passenger is not valid. I need urgent verification," she said, louder than necessary, as if raising her voice could bend the truth to her will. Damien closed his eyes briefly when he heard the words, "not valid." That phrase was not new. It was the story of his life, repeated in banks, hotels, boardrooms, even outside the door of a restaurant, where someone once said to his face, "We do not think you can afford it." Except now there was one difference. Back then he could do nothing but swallow the hurt. Today the power sat quietly in his hands, even if he refused to wield it impulsively. A young flight attendant, Tyler Brooks, 27 years old, burst out from behind the curtain, as if he had finally been handed the chance to exercise the small authority he always believed he had. This again he laughed under his breath, his voice laced with a hint of satisfaction. Fake tickets, sitting in the good seats, hoping no one checks. That smile, thin as a thread and sharp as a needle, pierced something deep inside Damien's chest, but he still did not move. In row 4, a middle-aged man leaned forward, his eyes filled with judgment. "We all know who first class is for," he said to his wife, making no effort to lower his voice. Lines like that had become background noise in Damien's life, but this time they did not cut the way they once did. They were simply revealing the people who spoke them. In row 3, a young woman with long black hair continued recording her hand, trembling slightly, but her eyes steady. She leaned toward the person beside her and whispered, "He has not said a word." They already decided he is guilty. That small sentence, soft yet ringing like a bell, made Heather whip around. "Mum, turn off your phone. This is a no-recording zone." But instead of lowering the device, the woman raised it higher like a symbol of resistance. Then another phone lifted, and another. Small red lights glowed across the cabin like tiny eyes of justice opening one by one. At the center of the storm, Damien opened his eyes again, his gaze fixed on the space before him, but it was not empty. It was focused, analytical calculating. He was reading every detail, the trembling hands of a passenger, the quiet satisfaction hidden in someone's laugh, the flicker of doubt crossing another's expression. He saw this cabin more clearly than the ceiling above him. Heather still refused to back down, convinced that authority lived in the loudness of her voice. "You are sitting in the wrong seat. Your ticket is not valid. If you do not move now, we will exercise our right to have security remove you." Damien inhaled, not to stay calm, but to hold the exact right moment. Because some moments require silence, not out of weakness, but because the truth is gathering strength, preparing to burst open with a force powerful enough to pull an entire system into its epicenter. Heather had no chance to say more before footsteps echoed down the aisle. Firm, deliberate, purposeful. Captain Michael Grant, 48 years old, a man who believed his uniform granted him absolute judgment, appeared like the judge of this unfolding execution. He stood before Damien, his powerful eyes sweeping downward, as if inspecting an intruder. "This is your final warning," he said, his voice hard as stone. "You will leave this seat immediately." The cabin held its breath. A young man in row 5 whispered to his wife, "He is not doing anything. Why are they pushing so hard?" But that question was swallowed instantly when a woman responded coldly, "Just look at him. You can tell." Another cut. Damien felt each word like a rope, tightening around the neck of an innocent man. But he did not let it choke him. Not today. Not in front of these people. Not when he knew they were moments away from witnessing something far beyond their expectations. The captain lowered his voice slightly, still loud enough for the cabin to hear. "This is the final decision. If you do not step out of this seat," Damien lifted his eyes, looked straight at him, and spoke 4 words, quiet but sharp. "Run my name, then." Those words did not only make the captain freeze, they sent a jolt through the entire cabin. Tyler let out a mocking laugh. Heather's lips tightened. A few passengers lowered their phones, tilting their heads. Because that was not the voice of a frightened man. It was the voice of someone who knew he belonged exactly where he was sitting. The cabin hung between 2 forces, the authority wrapped in uniforms and the steel edge of his silence. Then from row 3, the young woman recording spoke louder now, no longer whispering, "He is not scared. Something is wrong here." That simple, honest sentence dropped like water on hot stone, cracking the surface. Heather spun around, furious. "You are not allowed to interfere." But dozens of eyes turned toward her, no longer shaky like before. Something was shifting, rising, reversing, preparing to flip the entire situation. And Damien felt it clearly. Because sometimes to expose a rotten system, the strongest thing a person can do is stay seated. Wait for the right moment. Wait for the right words. Wait for the right second to let all the lies collapse under their own weight. And that moment was coming closer with every passing breath. The first crack in the wall of authority did not come with a sound, but with a look. Captain Michael Grant's eyes stalled the moment he heard Damien say, "Run my name, then." It lasted only half a second, but that half second was enough for the entire first-class cabin to sense that something no longer fit the script they were used to, because an accused man was supposed to panic, to beg, to explain. But Damien Cole did not. He simply sat there, calm to the point of coldness, as if he were not the one being threatened, but the one waiting for someone else to tighten the noose they had made for themselves. Heather Collins could not stand that silence. She tilted her head, her voice sharper and louder than necessary. "We do not need to run your name. The procedure is clear." She pressed hard on the word procedure, as if it were her golden excuse to legitimize every insult she had thrown. Tyler Brooks, wearing a smile, thin as a blade, let out a mocking laugh. "Right, who do you think you are? Sitting in seat 2. When you do not look like someone who can pay for seat 2A. A few passengers laughed along a thin, needle-like sound that tightened the air even more. But in the rows behind them, whispers began to change tone. Why do they not just check his name? Look at him. He does not look like a scammer. This is not about checking a ticket. This is humiliation. The words were not loud, but they were loud enough for Heather to catch, and loud enough for the captain to feel the control slipping from him, piece by piece, like chipped paint falling off an old wall. Damien remained silent. But it was the kind of silence that made the people facing him feel like they were the ones being judged. A young man in row 5 lifted his phone, higher face, turning serious. This is going viral for real. An elderly woman in row 4 leaned on her armrest, her voice trembling yet clear. I have flown this airline for 30 years. I have never seen them treat anyone like this. Heather heard it, and she hated it. She hated that the narrative was no longer in her hands. So she did what people who are weak with power always do when it slips from their fingers. She hit harder. You are a fraudulent passenger, Heather shouted, trying to drown every doubt beneath the volume of her voice. Security is on the way, and you will be escorted off. The declaration struck the air like a hammer, startling some passengers and making others frown at the excessiveness. Damien closed his eyes briefly, not out of fear, but because he felt the past rising 23 years old, thrown out of a business lounge despite a valid ticket. 27 years old, dismissed by a hotel clerk. 30 years old in his first meeting with an investor who questioned him not for his skill, but for his skin. Those memories no longer hurt. They simmered like embers in his chest, quiet, steady, fueling his resolve. When he opened his eyes, his gaze had changed. He looked directly at the captain without anger, without fear, only with a calmness sharp enough to unbalance the man standing over him. "Why will you not run my name?" Damien asked, his voice so soft it was almost gentle, yet each word fell like a stone into water, sending ripples through every row. The captain did not answer immediately. His silence made the question heavier. Heather cut in. "No need. Your ticket is not valid." The woman with the black hair still recording spoke up. "He did not do anything wrong. You tore his ticket before checking." Heather spun around, furious. "You are not allowed to film." But the rows behind her lifted their phones even higher, like a forest of glowing eyes, choosing to stand with Damien. Captain Grant tightened the strap of his cap, leaning in slightly, his voice layered with irritation. "We do not need to check because, based on observation, he does not fit the profile of a first-class passenger." The cabin froze. Damien heard the phrase "based on observation" with perfect clarity. It tasted exactly like the sentence he heard at 22. "You do not look like a business-class passenger. Or at 27, people like you do not belong here." But he did not argue. Not yet. Because sometimes to expose the truth, the wisest choice is to let the wrongdoers speak until they bury themselves. A small voice from row 6 rose soft but unmistakable. "That is profiling. That is discrimination, plain and obvious." Heather clenched her teeth. "Stay silent or we will remove you from the aircraft." But she said it too quickly, too sharply, like someone losing power 1 inch at a time. And the cabin was beginning to notice. Damien felt the eyes shifting away from judging him and toward judging the crew. Some frowned. Some leaned back. Some even looked embarrassed for the airline. But the tension was far from over, because at that moment, from the end of the cabin, Fast footsteps approached the airport security officers arriving. Heather gave a premature, triumphant smile. "It is over. You will be taken off." And that was the moment Damien understood the time had arrived. Every eye was on him, every phone recording, every breath of tension stretched to its limit. He opened his eyes, slid his hand toward the pocket of his vest, brushing the edge of the fabric, preparing to do something no one in that cabin could possibly expect. Because sometimes the truth does not need to be shouted. It only needs the right moment to touch a single domino and let the entire system collapse on its own. And that moment was now, as the footsteps of airport security echoed from the back of the cabin like a drum signaling the hour of execution. Damien Cole opened his eyes, fully placed 2 fingers on the pocket of his vest, and moved with a slow, deliberate precision, not like a man preparing to defend himself, but like someone about to put a final period on a distorted performance that had gone on long enough. Heather Collins noticed the motion and let out a triumphant smile, as if she had already reached the final verdict. "Call whoever you want. No one is saving you." That sentence became the last stone that struck the ember inside Damien and sharpened it into a blade of cold light. He pulled out his phone, not hurried, not trembling, but with the terrifying composure of someone who knew he was the highest-ranking person in a room others believed belonged only to them. He pressed one number, his finger gliding across the screen like a signature on a judgment. Then he put it on speaker. The ringing tone sounded once, twice, 3 times before a woman's voice came through, rounded, professional, every syllable clean, as if cut by a blade. "Lena Ward speaking. I'm here, sir." The air in the cabin froze solid. A man in row 5 whispered, "Sounds like an executive assistant." Damien looked directly at Captain Grant, his calm so absolute it made anyone who met his eyes feel their neck warm with unease. Then he said the words no one in the cabin could have predicted. "Lena, initiate. Flight Protocol 9. Notify the board immediately." Heather froze as if slapped. Tyler's eyes widened, his mouth falling open without a sound. Every passenger went still, except for Lena's voice, ringing clearly without a hint of hesitation. "Understood, Mr. Cole. Flight Protocol 9 is now active. From this moment forward, all cabin communication will be logged and transmitted directly to the Aurora Air Board of Directors." The young woman recording held her breath. A man gasped. The Board of Directors. Heather let out a laugh, but it was no longer the confident kind. It was the shaky laughter of someone clinging to a collapsing wall. "You think fake phone calls scare us?" Damien glanced at her once, just once, and that look alone was enough to raise goosebumps on anyone nearby. "Lena," he continued board status. The woman's voice returned immediately, each word carving a straight line through the suffocating air. "Chairman Holloway and Senior Member Lindstrom have received the alert. They are now in emergency standby mode according to protocol." A soft "my God" broke out from the back. Another passenger nodded sharply. "No one talks like that, unless it's real." Captain Grant stepped forward half a step, trying to gather what little authority he had left within the fabric of his uniform. "Listen to me. You are just a passenger. We are the ones running this flight." But his words no longer carried weight. They fell flat on the hard floor like shattered glass, because Lena's voice cut through the silence, at that exact moment, stronger than before. "Mr. Cole, the system has recorded all dialogue from Captain Michael Grant, lead attendant Heather Collins, and attendant Tyler Brooks. Everything is being transmitted to the legal office and the board in real time." Heather's face drained of color, Tyler stood rigid, hands trembling. Captain Grant's jaw tightened, but the flash of fear in his eyes was unmistakable. Only then did Damien sit a little straighter, his hand still resting lightly on the armrest, his voice lowering like the final note before a shift in an orchestra. "I asked you to check my name from the beginning." No one replied. "You refused." His voice stayed calm and slow, but each word was a velvet-wrapped bullet. "You tore up my ticket." Heather swallowed hard, her skin turning pale. "You humiliated me in front of these passengers, accusing me without verifying a single piece of information." Tyler lowered his head, his fingers shaking so badly he could not grip the edge of his belt. Damien inhaled, then spoke with a clarity sharp enough to cut metal. "And now you will answer to the very system you believed you represented." Captain Grant barked back, grabbing at the last thread of authority. "You still have no authority to stop this flight," Lena responded instantly, as if she had anticipated the objection. "Captain Grant, according to Clause 12.1b of Aurora Air Regulations, when Flight Protocol 9 is activated by the individual holding ultimate operational authority, the involved crew is placed under direct supervision of the Board of Directors. Flight control has temporarily transferred to the reserve command crew." The cabin erupted in a wave of shocked whispers. "Ultimate operational authority, Protocol 9. Who is he?" Heather, Tyler, and Grant all stared at Damien, and for the first time, all three wore the exact same expression: fear. Not fear of his voice, not fear of an outburst. They feared his silence. They feared the power in his restraint, in the few words he chose to speak. An elderly woman in row 4 whispered, I think they messed with the wrong man." And in that moment Damien stood up, not abruptly, not theatrically, but with a calm so cold it felt like the entire ladder of authority had just been rebuilt into its rightful order. His gaze swept across the people who had insulted him, and with just a breath they understood the stage they constructed was about to be torn apart. Because from that second on, no one in the cabin thought Damien Cole was just a regular passenger. Now every single person realized they were standing in the presence of a truth far bigger than themselves, one that had just touched the first domino and set the entire system on the edge of collapse. When Damien Cole rose to his feet, the air inside the first-class cabin felt as if an invisible hand had gripped it tight, making every breath from the passengers short, tense, and uneven. He did not need to raise his voice. He did not need to posture or threaten, yet that very calmness, cold enough to chill bone, made Heather Collins, Tyler Brooks, and Captain Michael Grant feel as though the ground had just been pulled out from beneath them. They no longer looked at him with the contempt they had worn at the beginning, but with the dawning realization of people who had picked the wrong man, at the wrong moment, under the wrong circumstances. Damien placed his phone gently on the side table next to seat 2A. The speaker still on, with Lena Ward's voice echoing through the cabin like a steady metronome recording every word, every breath, every command. Flight Protocol 9 is in full operation. All cabin data is being transmitted directly to the legal office and the board of directors. A few passengers raised their hands to their mouths, unable to believe what they were hearing. A bearded man in row 5 muttered, "Real-time transmission." Who even has the authority to trigger something like that? The young woman who had been filming from the start gripped her phone tighter, her eyes glowing with the certainty of instinct. "I knew it. He is not a regular person." Heather tried to seize control again by rushing forward, her voice cracking from fear. "You cannot stand here. Sit down right now. We have not given you permission." But the words fell flat like a dead leaf hitting damp wood. No weight, no authority left. Damien turned his head, looking straight at her. Not with anger, but with truth, and that truth alone made Heather stumble back half a step, as if a cold wind had hit her in the face. "I gave you a chance," Damien said, his voice low as stone, yet sending a shiver through every spine in the cabin. "I asked you to verify my information. I stayed silent when you insulted me. I allowed the truth to speak for itself." He stepped forward once, and the sound of his shoe, soft, light, yet heavy as a hammer, echoed across the cabin. And now he continued, "You will hear the truth whether you want to or not." Captain Grant tried to pull the last fragments of authority around himself, his voice sharp with desperation. "You have no authority to do this. I am the one operating this flight." But his protest had not even fully left his mouth when Lena's voice sliced straight through it with the precision of a blade. "Captain Grant, your statement is factually incorrect. Flight Command Authority has been temporarily transferred to the Reserve Command Crew by top-level order. You are requested to step away from the command position." A stunned "good heavens" erupted from row 3. Another man gaped. She said it straight out loud. Heather staggered forward, her face drained. "No. No, impossible. They cannot do that instantly. That is not how an airline—" But Lena's voice rose again, cutting off her panic entirely. "Additional notice. Access privileges for Miss Collins have been temporarily revoked due to indicators of severe conduct violations." Heather jerked, reaching instinctively for the company tablet at her hip. Its screen was pitch black. She pressed the unlock button. Nothing. She tried again. Still dead. No, this cannot be happening." Tyler Brooks looked down at the ID card clipped to his belt. The indicator light had gone dark. He tapped it against the cabin reader. No beep. No flash. The doorway of authority he had always leaned on had slammed shut in seconds. What is happening?" he whispered. But the question was aimed at no one. It was the quiet collapse of a man who had just lost the foundation beneath his feet. The passengers behind them erupted in whispers. "Their access is locked. It is real. All of it is real. My goodness, he actually holds top-level control." An elderly woman clasped the hand of the person beside her. They insulted the wrong man." Damien inhaled deeply, then placed a hand on his chest like a judge preparing to deliver the final verdict. "You asked who I am, Damien," said his voice soft as wind, yet powerful as thunder. He looked around the cabin, every eye fixed on him like a jury. "I will answer." He straightened his back, his dark eyes sharpening. "My name is Damien Cole." A camera shutter clicked. Chief Executive Officer of Aurora Air. A sharp gasp shot across the cabin. "Major shareholder and the highest decision-maker in the very system you all claimed to represent when you humiliated me." The sentence fell into the cabin like a firecracker, igniting dry timber, blasting through every corner of the room. Heather's jaw dropped, but no sound came out. Tyler stumbled back, bumping into the seat behind him. Captain Grant closed his eyes, as if watching his entire career crumble in front of him. Damien looked at them, not with rage, but with the disappointment of a leader seeing the ethical rot inside his own team. "All my life," Damien said, "I have been judged by appearance, by color, by assumptions others made about me. And I always chose silence, always chose to rise above it." His voice deepened, warm yet heavy. "Today I am not silent. Not because I am weak, but because my system is weak, and I must repair it. The cabin fell utterly still. No one moved. No one dared to breathe too loudly. And in that silence, Damien delivered the line that made every person in the cabin shudder. You did not humiliate me. You only unmasked yourselves. And in that moment, with dozens of phones raised, dozens of witnesses watching, that was when the entire system began to fall under the weight of truth. The moment the name Damien Cole, Chief Executive Officer of Aurora Air, echoed through the cabin, the entire space felt as if someone had pressed a pause button. Every breath hung suspended in the air, and the 3 uniformed crew members standing before him turned to stone as though the floor had collapsed beneath them, but none of them had the strength to react. Heather Collins stood frozen, her eyes wide, her pupils shrinking, as if she had just seen disaster unfold directly in front of her. Tyler Brooks stepped back another half step, gripping the edge of a seat, as his hands trembled uncontrollably, while Captain Michael Grant stared at Damien, the way a man stares at a mountain he cannot climb, cannot go around, and cannot pretend does not exist. But that paralysis was only the beginning. The real collapse began when Lena Ward's voice returned soft, yet sharp as a blade, carving into the last thin shell of authority the 3 crew members had been clinging to. Urgent notice. The Board of Directors has formally acknowledged the incident. All involved personnel are ordered to cease operations immediately until further investigation. A wave of gasps swept across the cabin like a burst of hot wind. One passenger whispered, "They were suspended on the spot." Another spoke louder, "This is no joke. This is a real Chief Executive Officer." Heather reached for the radio clipped to her uniform, hoping for some final miracle to salvage the situation. But when she pressed the button, the radio emitted a single long tone, then went silent. The screen died. The sound died. Her authority died. Her sharp inhalation echoed like a stifled sob clawing its way up her throat. No, this cannot be real. Tyler tried sliding his ID card against the reader on the cabin wall. No light. No signal. Nothing but suffocating silence, the kind that surrounds someone cut off from the very system they once relied on. He whispered shakily, We really are locked out." Captain Grant gripped his own radio, determined to communicate with ground control the way he believed he still had the right to do. But when he lifted the device to his mouth, it was already dead. He pressed the button. No light, no sound, no transmission. And that was when the color drained from his face, leaving him the grey shade of ashes. "Impossible," he murmured loud enough for all passengers to hear. "The system has locked me out." The rows behind them erupted in shocked whispers. He really lost command. The Chief Executive Officer can do that? My goodness, they picked the wrong man to provoke. Damien watched the scene unfold, feeling not satisfaction, but a deep, solemn disappointment. He did not smirk. He did not raise his eyebrows. He did not revel in victory. He simply looked at the 3 people who had stood above him less than 10 minutes earlier, now reduced to living evidence of a truth he had long known. The system does not fail because of policy. It fails because of the people within it. Damien stepped closer, not to intimidate them, but to force them to face the consequences of their own choices. "You claimed the name of procedure," he said, his voice calm, yet peeling away each layer of pretense. "But not one of you followed procedure." Heather bit her lip so hard it bled. Tyler lowered his head, scrambling for something solid to hold on to. Captain Grant stood motionless, as a man who had just realized that he had not only lost command, he had lost his career. Damien continued, slow and precise, like delivering a verdict that could never be overturned. You did not check my information. You did not check my ticket. You did not check my name. You checked only the color of my skin. A soft sob escaped from a passenger in row 4. Heather tried to speak, but her throat closed around the words. The woman filming nodded strongly. We recorded everything. Every word. An older passenger added, "Nobody forced them. They chose this themselves." Damien turned toward the passengers, his tone warmer. Power does not begin with shouting. It begins with choosing the right moments to stay silent and the right moment to speak. Then he faced the crew again, his gaze sharpening. "And now is the moment I speak." He picked up his phone, pressing the single glowing button. "Lena, proceed to the next step." Lena replied instantly, her voice cold as metal sliding across glass. "Understood, Mr. Cole. Requesting confirmation, suspend system access, disable control panels, and revoke keycard authorization for all 3 involved personnel." Damien answered, with a voice that did not need emphasis. "Confirmed." The cabin burst into stunned reactions. Heather clutched her head. Tyler collapsed into a seat. Captain Grant gripped his capstrap, his face white as paper. A man in row 6 said loudly, "They were fired on the spot." An elderly woman whispered, shaking they should have treated the passenger better, especially someone they did not know. Damien looked at them, those who had mocked him, belittled him, commanded him, and spoke a single sentence, soft yet etched deep into the memory of all who heard it. "This is not revenge. This is the truth finding its rightful place." And with that sentence, the system they once believed they commanded collapsed completely right in the middle of the first-class cabin of the very airline he led. The moment Damien Cole confirmed the suspension order, the entire cabin erupted into a storm of emotions never seen on any commercial flight: shock, outrage, satisfaction, and above all else, a heavy, sudden awakening. The crew who once stood at the summit of authority now resembled wax statues melting under the blistering heat of truth. The strange thing was, Damien never once stepped forward to push them down. He simply stood there, wrapped in a calm, almost unreal, and let their own actions drag them into the abyss they had created. The passengers looked at him and understood something crystal clear. They were not just witnessing discrimination. They were witnessing a living lesson in real power, the kind that does not require shouting intimidation or theatrics, the kind that needs only a single sentence, a single nod to make an entire system stop, bow, and confront itself. Heather Collins covered her face, her eyes reddening though no tears fell, not from guilt, but from horror. "I didn't know. I didn't know who you were," she stammered, her voice cracking her hands, trembling so badly she nearly dropped the dead radio. Damien turned toward her, his eyes deep, carrying no malice, but offering no shield either. "That is exactly the problem," he said, his voice low, resonating through the air like a drum falling into the earth. "You did not need to know who I am to treat me properly." A young passenger whispered a single line, quiet but ringing like a bell. "Exactly. That is the problem." Tyler Brooks, who had stood behind Heather, laughing moments earlier, now shrank into his seat. He stuttered, I was just following. I thought Damien cut him off," not raising his voice, yet silencing Tyler instantly. "You thought wrong. And because of that wrong thought, you became a willing hand in a system more toxic than you are." Captain Grant still stood there, but the authority he clung to had vanished long ago. He looked like a man watching the end of his career unfold in real time, powerless to stop it. His breath shook, and when he spoke, his voice broke, stripped of every ounce of command. "I only wanted to keep the flight safe." Damien turned fully toward him. "No," he said firmly. "You wanted to keep your pride safe." A shocked "good heavens" escaped an elderly passenger. Another nodded sharply, as if the words struck the truth they had sensed all along, but could never articulate. Damien inhaled slowly, then delivered each word with clarity. If you truly cared about safety, you would have checked the information. If you truly cared about your passengers, you would not have allowed your personal bias to cloud your judgment. If you truly cared about procedure, you would have followed it instead of using it as a shield. No one dared breathe loudly. A few whispered among themselves, "He is right." They did not follow any real procedure. It was all prejudice. Damien looked around the cabin where dozens of eyes were fixed on him, and in those eyes he saw something they had not understood until now. His initial silence had not been weakness. It had been a test, and the first-class cabin had failed that test catastrophically. Damien continued, his voice slow and sharp. "When I stayed silent, I gave you the opportunity to show who you were." He looked at Heather. "You chose to insult a passenger who caused no trouble." He looked at Tyler. "You chose to mock instead of verify." Then he faced the captain. "And you chose the wrong side, believing the power of your hat would protect you from consequence." A woman in a business suit in row 3 lifted her phone higher. "We recorded everything she announced clearly. No one can deny what happened." Lena's voice returned through the speaker, steady as the ticking of time. "Note all cabin audio and video have been saved to Aurora Air's secure system, preparing final stage of Protocol 9. Damien glanced at the phone, then raised his eyes to the 3 crew members, his gaze a mirror reflecting the truth they could no longer escape. "You believed you had the right to decide who belongs in this cabin." He paused. "But real power is not in taking a seat from someone else." He rested his hand on the back of seat 2A. "Real power is knowing what to do when you are already in the right seat." His words fell into the silence, drawing a curtain across the scene, leaving behind a heavy darkness full of reflection. A male passenger spoke up from the back, his voice deep with respect. That is real leadership. Damien turned to the passengers, his expression resolute. "I did not stand up to prove that I was right," he said. "I stood up to prove that injustice, even the smallest, must be seen." Heather collapsed into the nearest seat, burying her head in her hands. Tyler gasped for breath like a man caught in a storm. Captain Grant could no longer find a single word to defend the hollow authority he once believed in. And in that heavy stillness, Damien spoke the final line that sent a ripple of fear and reverence through the entire cabin. "You didn't misjudge me. You misjudged yourselves." And with that sentence, the courtroom in the sky reached its verdict without a gavel, only truth echoing through every pair of eyes, locked on the 3 people who had just lost everything. The moment that invisible courtroom closed, the cabin sank into a thick, unmoving silence. No one dared to shift. No one dared to breathe too loudly, as if any motion might shatter the truth hanging heavy in the air between them. Damien Cole stood there, his shadow cast over the 3 suspended crew members, not as a victor, but as the clearest reflection of the consequences they had created for themselves. Heather Collins remained buried in her hands, unable to lift her head, her mind filled with a single echoing thought. If she had chosen kindness just once, none of this would be happening. Tyler Brooks staggered, as he tried to stand, his legs trembling like they no longer belonged to him, his mouth repeating the word, although he already knew. The answer was standing right in front of him. Captain Michael Grant stayed frozen, staring toward the closed cockpit door, as if he had been severed from the very place that once defined his authority. Yet the most unsettling thing was not their panic. It was the transformation in the eyes of the passengers. Those who had begun merely curious were now witnesses. Those who hesitated at first now understood they were standing in a moment far more significant than a simple argument on a plane. And those who had sided with the crew were left only with regret as they faced a truth too stark to deny. Damien drew a long, steady breath, his gaze sweeping across the cabin, not searching for admiration, but measuring the weight of the damage this moment had carved into everyone present. He looked at Heather, then Tyler, then Captain Grant, and his voice sank low, striking the air like a verdict that left no room for misunderstanding. My silence was not weakness. It was the last chance you chose not to take. A young passenger exhaled sharply, whispering, as if he feared speaking too loudly in the presence of something greater than himself. He really is a leader. Damien rested his hand gently on the back of seat 2. Not to claim ownership, but to remind everyone that everything had started from this very place. I do not need anyone to acknowledge that I belong here, he said, his voice soft, yet edged with unmistakable clarity. I only needed to see who does not deserve the position they hold. And as those words dissolved into the stillness, the entire cabin understood that the battle had ended, not with shouting, not with struggle, but with silence. A silence that had become the final sentence. The silence that covered the first-class cabin did not last long because moments later, every breath and every glance began to shift, as if the entire room had just awakened from a long sleep. No one looked at Damien Cole as a suspicious passenger anymore. They looked at him as the man who had pulled back the curtain that hid the truth for so many years, as the one who had struck a warning bell straight into their hearts. An elderly woman slowly placed a hand over her chest, her eyes glistening with emotion. If it were not for you, this would keep happening to others. A middle-aged businessman stood up cautiously and bowed his head toward Damien. I apologize for misjudging you from the beginning. And one by one they began to nod, not because he was the chief executive officer, but because they had just witnessed injustice being exposed in the most powerful way possible through truth. Heather Collins lifted her face, her eyes red and swollen, no longer carrying defiance or arrogance. All that remained was the fractured weight of what she had done. She tried to find words, but when her lips trembled, what slipped out was not an excuse, nor a justification, but a fragile whisper. I was wrong. Tyler Brooks turned away, unable to meet anyone's gaze, gripping the seat to steady himself against the collapse inside him. Captain Grant stood upright, but that upright posture was no longer authority. It was the final effort of a man trying to hold on to the last fragment of his dignity. Yet what truly transformed the cabin was not their remorse. It was Damien's presence. A man in row 5 murmured, "He does not need to shout. He does not need to threaten." Yet everyone listens. A young woman turned to her companion, her voice filled with awe. This is the first time I have seen what real strength looks like. Damien looked at them, his eyes gentle yet deep, as if he understood the emotions of every person in the cabin and was ready to carry the weight of the moment with them. None of us are perfect, he said softly. Yet the entire cabin heard him clearly. But every one of us has the responsibility to see what is wrong and to refuse to stay silent. And as those words spread through the air, every pair of eyes in the cabin turned toward him, not because of his title or authority, but because their hearts had just been awakened. When Damien Cole gently lifted his phone one last time, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what final act would bring this chaos to a close. He raised it closer to the speaker, his voice low and resolute. "Lena, conclude Protocol 9. And immediately, the professional voice of the woman replied, "Completed, Mr. Cole. Access privileges for all 3 involved personnel have been permanently revoked. The full report is being delivered to the board and the legal department." That sentence was not just the ending for the crew. It was the moment the entire cabin understood that justice does not always require shouting, only a steady hand capable of holding on to the truth until the very last second. Heather lowered her head, her shoulders trembling with no hint of defiance left in her. Tyler leaned back into his seat, his eyes hollow, like someone who had lost his entire future because of a single moment of arrogance. Captain Grant stood still, lips pressed tightly, the weathered face of a seasoned pilot, now covered in the weight of defeat. But Damien didn't look at them with hatred. He looked with the understanding of someone who knew that every lesson comes with a cost, and today that cost had been paid through a truth they could no longer escape. He turned back to the cabin, his voice gentle yet firm. "The flight will continue, with a new crew, and with the respect every one of us deserves." The passengers nodded, some offering applause, not to celebrate him, but to acknowledge the moment they had just witnessed. A moment in which dignity rose above prejudice, and justice found its rightful place, again high above the clouds. From the perspective of an expert in leadership and organizational ethics, the story of Damien Cole reveals an undeniable truth. Lasting strength does not come from shouting. It comes from the ability to stand firm in the face of injustice and let truth speak for itself. It is that calm resilience that exposed the cracks in the service culture, revealing how power can be misused when respect is absent and internal oversight fails. If this story convinces you that dignity must be protected everywhere, whether on the ground or in the sky, then, like the video, to spread the message and subscribe so you do not miss the next journeys toward justice. Before you leave, share a short comment of no more than 3 words to remind each other of today's lesson: respect first,